Hey, friends, we're back. I hope that you're doing great today. We are ready to go for day 27 of our lives. And today we are going to have a amazing conversation about the Ninth and 14th Amendment. We're going to turn into a discussion about Roe versus Wade that hopefully kind of answers some of the background questions that you might have about the significance of this court case. So let's get started, shall we? All right. So you know who I am. It's me. It's Miss Hitch. I'm here. It is gross outside today. Can I just tell you, 2 inches of rain, and it's so cold. I'm wearing. I'm like, where's everything I can wear to be warm? So like I said, we're looking at the 14th Amendment. We're looking at court cases. We're going to talk about strict scrutiny, equal protection clause, all of those things. So I had a great question from a student who I'm assuming their name is Joey, about the new tools that I went over yesterday from College Board that can help you practice as the exam date approaches. So if you are self-studying AP Gov, you should still have access to these materials. You should be able to go back through your school or your host school, whomever that is. If you kind of need a point of contact, try looking for the AP coordinator or your counselor, and they will have registered you for an exam only section, and it will give you access that way through AP Classroom. So that person will be able to get that information to you. Please make sure that you contact them so that you have adequate time to practice. My next question, we had a lovely back and forth last night that went on and on about Gideon versus Wainwright, and one of the questions that came from my AP. So I wanted to share that with you because it brings up a really interesting point. The response that the correct response was the Sixth Amendment right to counsel provision applies to those accused of major crimes under state laws. And the question that had been asked was, doesn't this apply to everyone who's been accused of a crime? So if we go back to Gideon and we're looking at the question, there's usually a question that's presented the court, and that question is limiting to it acts as a limitation on what the court can and will not look at because of the nature of precedent and kind of tradition. But the Sixth Amendment case was Gideon was looking specifically at whether or not the right to an attorney for what was called indigent defendants, individuals who were economically disadvantaged, if it applied to cases that were felonious but non-capital. And so that is really where this case centers on, is that if you are charged with a felony in a state court, that you have the right to representation. There have been subsequent cases since Gideon versus Wainwright that have expanded that to misdemeanors. So we have had, further decisions that have impacted, and really in particular, that right to an attorney, right to representation has been great for individual rights. But just like we've been talking about, there's always a trade-off there, that it has had the impact of creating quite a, in some states more than others, but a huge financial outlay for the economically disadvantaged representation rights that has not always received great taxpayer funding. And therefore you see the public defender's office engaged in more cases than you would see maybe in other states, and it impacts, it has an impact on the degree or the quality of representation that they get. So, all right, we are going to take a look. This was our question last night this was from the Pretrial Institute, which is why we need pretrial reform. Lots of statistics here. And we had a question that looked at powers of Congress, and then turned the corner in the same prompt. We had an explain, but that explain was for how that would be affected by special interest groups. The B point was how elections affect a legislator's willingness to respond. And then our C point is how the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution would affect that interaction between Congress and special interests. And I saw a lot of different ways in which students tackled this. All of them, it was interesting. I love seeing where you guys go with this. This was kind of an open-ended question. because it's one that I wrote. So it's not going to be as perfect as what you might get out of College Board, but nonetheless, it's something for us to practice. So I'm going to try this one more time. I know that you guys sometimes have a hard time seeing what is going. So I tried to take a response and really zoom in on it so that you guys would have a better view, getting larger font. So hopefully this helps. And I also went ahead and pre-graded it so that you can see where I might be coming at. But this is one of our responses, a little bit shorter, right? But again, we're looking to see, I remember how I've asked you to do identify, describe, and explain for each of the sections. And it's going to get complicated as we start to see multiple verbs that go in different directions within each response. So here, the student's response says Congress can create legislation. Again, this is our identify, right? That puts a specific amount of bail or bond money on a crime, right? So this is a description on why legislation is effective. It is sufficient. I mean, we could clarify this by putting in things like federal requirements on bond and bail money, a cap on them, so on and so forth. But I mean, I have a good understanding. It's a sufficient description as to why this legislation would effectively address the issue brought up by the Pretrial Institute in the prompt. So we turn the corner, and we see a nice explanation here in pink, right? That way a person can't be discriminated against for race and gender, right? We might want to put in here in dealing with the court and establishing bail or bond, but it kind of relies on here. So again, this would be sufficient. It's a little sparse, but it gets the job done. However, because the prompt takes the explain in a different direction and we're explaining a relationship of another party, we need to make sure that we do the identify, describe, and explain for the second half of A, and that is dealing with special interest groups. So here they have a identification of an action that can be taken by an interest group, right? We're lobbying, and a description, again, it's a little sparse, but it's telling us that they are going to pass or fail legislation. I might consider, since we're writing the full 15 minutes, of adding in here maybe something about what that legislation is, getting back to this up here, right? We're getting a little sparse. So I'm starting to have to make some inferences about what's being discussed. But the real issue here is that there's no explain for what that special interest group. So I don't see the student telling me that their understanding of lobbying, and this would be what that lobbying would be advocating for, they're not telling me how this would affect what Congress is doing. And that is a very important component, right? Now, you could say, well, like, isn't this it right here, right? Passing or failing. But I really feel like because the student has a very sparse description of what lobbying does, I need you to follow through, even if it's repetitive, and really make sure that you're connecting that point. And it can be just as simple as, because an interest group has affected the passage of a bill, that means that Congress can't proceed forward with whatever that policy issue is. It's just completing that thought, because remember, I'm going to say again that the impetus is on you to do all of the heavy lifting within that response, right? I, as the reader, I don't know whose it is. It's completely anonymous. I can't trace who it is. So I can't assume that because you're leaving off a couple of words, like you might see like in a classroom, right? Like if I see a kid, I'm like, oh, I know they know this, right? But when we're talking about an anonymous test in which I have no way of knowing who you are in your response, you have to complete that entire thought so that I have to make zero inferences. And that's what this is running into, is that I cannot infer here that you know how this action is going to affect this action. It's just close the loop, right? Okay, depending, so we turn to B. This is the one talking about the effect on, I forget what the effect is. Let me look and see if I can pull that back up for myself so I'm on the right one. So the prompt was, in the context of the scenario, explain how elections might affect a legislator's willingness to respond to the issue outlined. All right, so depending on how divided the government is, so here we're pulling in some interesting outside information. and the district representative is running in. So good, we're putting some caveats in here showing we understand something. A legislator can put more or less effort into making sure equality is met. Now, here's my issue with this. What I think you're identifying is this concept right here, more or less effort. And I'm going to come back around. I'm going to ask you a question. How would I know what more or less effort look like as a distinguishing component between the effort of a legislator or the effort of lobbying Congress? So you need to be really concrete with our verbs, right? What is a verb that you could throw in there that would allow me to conceptualize a specific tangible action that's unique to Congress, so that I see that something about an election is forcing or is preventing Congress from doing something. This we could say about any group, right? Special interest groups, we could say it about the government, we could say it about courts, whatever. So be precise. So that is the reason why I would say that this is a 0 point. So we have 2 0 points on the page. If we wanted to improve it, I would go right here, right? They are going to say additionally, a legislator who's a minority might be less likely. Here we see passing legislation, right, to bring equality. So this is a little better. Actually, this right here, before we get to giving them a 0 point, this is exactly what I was looking for in a concrete action. I just caught myself. I should have read on. All right. But this isn't explain. Okay. Passing legislation. That being said, during an election, it may receive more attention. Again, there's a lot of inferring that I have to do that is connecting how the specific event of an election is going to impact the ability to legislate, right? You're telling me that the student's response is telling me that it has something to do with divided government. It has something to do with the nature of representation in their district, and it might impact legislation. But these two components right here, in and of themselves, this is not elections. This is something else. So you would want to talk about constituents within the district. You would want to talk about constituents within the Senate race. Any manner, but this is an outgrowth. This is a product of an election, right? And this is a influencing factor, but it's not an election. It's not the same thing. So I'm going to go back and say we did try, but we're pulling in things that aren't related to impacting legislation by elections. All right. Our C point here, again, to refresh your memory, explain how the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution might affect the interaction between Congress and special interest groups. So now we're going to kick it back to, okay, how does this other institution affect it? So the Supreme Court can read the Constitution. Now, this might be an attempt at an identify, but again, I don't see a concrete action, right? I mean, anyone can read the Constitution. So I know I feel like I'm being persnickety here, but we need to use really solid, specific language that shows that this is an action that is unique to the courts, that I can see terminating in some event, right? Or some action. So here, when they say judicial review, I'm like, okay, this is better, right? Here is an action. I know it's a concept, and it might be a little shaky because I might have to make some inferences in terms of what does judicial review, how does a concept turn into an action, right? But here they're saying, Congress's actions or a special interest group wants is unconstitutional. So this is a little bit of my explanation. And up here, I get a description of what judicial review is. So this is a 1 out of 3, okay? So our kind of action points here is to make sure you're watching our verbs, right? They may not be connected to the same prompt within a letter. Make sure that you're really going through and you're thinking about a terminology or wording or verbiage that is unique to that branch that terminates in an action, and you're turning that corner into showing me how they're interrelated. So that is, I wanted to give you an example of one in which we could look for improvement before we move on.